Welcome to class. This is my attempt to use a variety of different media to explain something from history that I've kind of struggled with in the past. The temptation is just to do a lecture, and the lecture inevitably devolves into a series of acronyms and initialisms that are hard to keep straight. And so, again, using a combination of various media, I hope to present something that's comprehensible, that will compact the complexity that was the New Deal into the basis for some good notes and, I guess, enduring comprehension of what happened during this period of FDR's administration. So this is the New Deal from about 1933 to 1938. And the obvious context for that was the Depression, which in 1932 was hitting a pretty profound low. This photo, for example, portrays a bank run in progress, and this was a recurring theme both before the New Deal and even during it, where banks were failing and struggling mightily, and people were losing life savings and couldn't even count on the basic financial infrastructure so fundamental to the health of the economy. So in the context of this terrible depression, the struggles that the banks were fighting, the election of 1932 occurs. Herbert Hoover is the incumbent, and the Democrats nominate Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, at his nomination, issues this pledge. And you'll see in the core of this pledge was the phrase New Deal, that even at the time he maybe didn't realize would become such a profound aspect of the nomenclature for this period. But he ends up naming this program that will last most of the 30s at his nomination. This map portrays the totality and extent of FDR's electoral victory. So all the blue states went to FDR. It looks like Delaware, Pennsylvania, and some states up in New England go with Hoover. I'm not sure about why New England's enthusiastic about Hoover, but evidently they were. But all for naught, FDR wins. And this photograph, I think, captures the enthusiasm and the optimism that people voted for in him. And so just the cigarette holder sticking upward at this Johnny angle and his huge grin captures a lot about his personality. This is a photograph where, en route to the inauguration, FDR is with Hoover. And this is a famous New Yorker cover from that era that kind of, in cartoon fashion, indicates the contrast in personality and style of the presidents, and in a sense, the transition of the mood of that era from fearful and paralyzed to optimistic and energetic. So at the inauguration in 1933, this is where FDR makes his famous statement about fear. So I will refrain from the powerful temptation to read this word for word. I'm sure you can read this. We'll just pause, let you soak in the significance of what he's trying to communicate to the American public about suppressing fear and moving forward with their characteristic national energy. Any source you read about the New Deal or summary of its beginning will be quick to point out that FDR did not come in with a fully formed ideology. He did not have a fully formed plan. A lot of what he was doing was improvisational, but those improvisations were informed by three basic strategies: industrial recovery, agricultural recovery, and short-term emergency relief for people who are in such desperate straits. The other way to break down into three parts the basic arc of the New Deal was the three R's, so reform, recovery, and relief. The idea is with reform that broken government institutions would be improved, recovery, that the government would do its best to stimulate agriculture and industry, and relief, the government getting money and resources directly into the hands of people who needed it most at the time. FDR was quick to assemble something called the Brain Trust. Now, the first picture I put up with this is actually Eleanor Roosevelt, who probably wasn't officially considered part of the Brain Trust. However, she definitely deserves some attention as a profoundly important intellectual influence on the New Deal. Of course, married to FDR. They had a strained relationship, evidently. However, they did respect each other, and she had a profoundly humanizing impulse on FDR, reminding him frequently of the importance of his policies and how they would influence the truly poor and downtrodden and the marginalized. So even a progressive among progressives of that time, she deserves credit for really an important influence on the course of the New Deal with regard to its best humanitarian impulses. This was FDR's Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, the first woman cabinet member in the history of the United States. This was the Interior Secretary, Harold Ickes. And he wasn't just the Interior Secretary, he also administered a number of other important New Deal programs. So Harold Ickes would be a name that if you ever need to invoke a proper noun for somebody who really embodies the New Deal, this would be a good one to use. This is Henry Morgenthau, Secretary of the Treasury, and in a variety of ways he embodies the complexity of FDR and his administration, and so Mr. Morgenthau is Jewish, at a time when anti-Semitism was broad spread and surprisingly socially acceptable. And yet, FDR brought him into the administration, something that did infuriate some anti-Semites of that time. The irony of it, I guess, is that FDR, for all that he was friends with and worked with Henry Morgenthau, would also himself indulge, apparently, in anti-Semitic slurs in the course of casual conversation. So a complicated time. The New Deal began with the first 100 days, something historians refer to as this initial period of the New Deal, where FDR brought Congress together in a special session with the express purpose of hammering out legislation to quickly and dramatically address the crisis of the New Deal. These 100 days are still discussed with regard to presidents. It's a period at the beginning of any new presidency where the president presumably has a fresh mandate from the people who have just voted for him, or perhaps in the future her. And it's a time when presidents generally are believed to, somewhat correctly, have the best opportunity to introduce sweeping change and to enact whatever agenda they have. One of the first things FDR focused on during the 100 days was the bank problem. In 1933, 5,000 banks failed. More banks in 1 year than had failed previously over the course of the Depression. It was a really bad year for banks. And so with the Emergency Banking Act, FDR closes the banks and uses the 4-day closure to reassure the American public that the government is on the case and that people's savings are safe and that there is no need for them to run to the banks to withdraw their deposits. The Emergency Banking Act included increased regulation of the banks and supported the banks even with government resources to try to ensure that they wouldn't go under. The Banking Acts, there were actually multiple banking laws, and so there was a second Banking Act in June during the first 100 days. And the second Banking Act creates the FDIC, that is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the purpose of which is to insure citizens' deposits of up to $5,000. Even if a bank fails, they can recoup some of their money. The other thing that this second Banking Act did is it separated deposit banking from investment banking. So the overlap of those two types of banking had been a major cause for the absurdly inflating stock prices during the boom of the 20s. And so this was an attempt to address that. Now I put this in red, the CCC, or the Civil Conservation Corps, because this is one of the alphabet soup New Deal programs that I would like you to learn and remember and have sort of at the tip of your tongue, or I should say the tip of your pen. And that is the Civil Conservation Corps. The Civil Conservation Corps essentially hired young men, brought them away from their homes into encampments, where in these encampments, working as parts of teams, the young men worked on federal land to improve the parklands, in many cases doing erosion control, building trails, and constructing infrastructure for national parks. This put cash in the pockets of the young men that they could send home. It improved the parks. It expanded recreation opportunities for Americans. And actually, variations on this still exist to this day. This is a poster kind of capturing the ideal spirit of the CCC. This HOLC, Hulk, Home Owners Loan Corporation, extended government funds to home purchasers so that they could put down payments on, buy houses, and begin mortgages in an attempt to stimulate the housing market, which had, of course, suffered horrible reversals during the Depression. This is the Farm Credit Administration, which is essentially like an agricultural equivalent to the HOLC or HOLC. And so the Farm Credit Administration made money available to farmers to try to avoid foreclosure and to help support them to make payments on their farms and to cover debts, some of which you'll recall from John Green, they racked up in the course of mechanizing during World War I. The TVA is a red letter program of the New Deal, the first 100 days, and that stands for Tennessee Valley Authority. And the Tennessee Valley Authority essentially constructed dam infrastructure and put up, not as a pejorative, but put up dams throughout Appalachia, in particular in Tennessee, to harness the power of rivers, to control the intermittent and sometimes extreme flooding, and to make below market cost electricity available to the poor people in those regions. This was generally regarded as one of the more successful early New Deal programs, and it extended well past really what we consider the period of the New Deal, and had a profound influence on modernizing parts of Appalachia that had been forgotten economically and culturally. This, for example, is a dam that was constructed under the auspices of the TVA. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration was also one of the red letter and famous New Deal laws to come out of the 100 days. This one was a little bit weird. It had public relations problems because really its purpose was to subsidize farmers, not to grow crops. So in other words, the AAA extended resources to farmers to basically pay them to not grow crops or to raise certain livestock, the purpose of which was to lower production and try to stimulate a rise in prices for those commodities. It was good for the farmers who own lands and who own farms. The problem with the AAA, however, is that migrant farmers and tenant farmers lost work when farmers had no more incentive to hire the tenant farmers and the migrant workers to pick crops. So the AAA was one of the parts of the New Deal that had some kind of tough unintended consequences on some of the poorer people and victims of the Depression that was sweeping the land at that time. The NIRA, or the National Industrial Recovery Act, was a law that brought into existence the National Recovery Administration. So the NRA was the actual bureaucracy produced by this law that, as its symbol, had this blue eagle. The NRA, you can note, was an attempt, or sort of an FDR version of the associationalism that we had talked about with Hoover. It was an attempt to collaborate with industry to work out a balance between, on one hand, industry's needs to pay the lowest wages possible, but not too low, and to encourage industry to organize safe work environments and basically worker-friendly policies that were not so extreme as to undermine their ability to be profitable. So it's an attempt to balance. The NRA is a government involvement in trying to strike a balance between the needs of workers and industry. It was carried on with a lot of hoopla. The purpose of these Blue Eagles would be that businesses participating or companies participating would put these up, and the government would try to encourage citizens only to shop at, use companies that have the Blue Eagle. The NRA did not do very well. It was distrusted in many cases by business and was perhaps too reliant on voluntary compliance for it to work well. Now, one aspect of the NIRA that did have enduring and important legacy was Article 7A, which granted workers the right to collective bargaining. And so you see the beginning of a truly modern labor movement resting here in the NIRA, and we'll talk more about that later when we get to the Wagner Act. The NIRA also created the Public Works Administration, which really should be in red letters. It's one of the really big New Deal three-letter organizations, and the Public Works Administration pumped huge amounts of government money and organization into hiring people to make really heavy infrastructure. And so when you look at PWA projects, you'll see things like the steam shovel actually here photographed in Washington, D.C. And some of the other photos in my research revealed huge dams, massive bridges, very heavy machinery projects and big investments in big stuff. As we move into 1934 and 1935, so the 100 days end, and we move into 1934 and 1935, and the creation of the SEC. So that's the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's a government agency that still exists and persists in a really important role. It monitors the stock market. In other words, it monitors the trading of securities in any kind of investment environment. And this was a direct response to the excesses that led to the crash in 29. The FHA, Federal Housing Administration, marks the rise of the government as directly involved in trying to promote the availability of dwellings for Americans at a time when people were ending up in Hoovervilles. Now, as we move through 1934, midterm elections come. And so these are for Congress. They go really well for the Democrats. And so this quotation is from Harry Hopkins, one of the iconic New Deal administrators. And what he's saying there is in response to the totality of the Democrats' wins in these congressional elections. FDR gets a decisive majority in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And so with this kind of political backing, he'll have a lot of legislative freedom to do what he wants. And so you'll see the New Deal moving in an interesting and somewhat new direction. This, by the way, is Harry Hopkins talking to journalists. I like this photo because it kind of captures the swagger of FDR's gang, their confidence and their energy, and their importance, with journalists gathering around his desk, hanging on his every word. And this is Harry Hopkins with FDR in some kind of limousine. 1935. A lot happens in 1935, and I'm actually departing from the typical presentation of the New Deal by making that year an organizing principle. So in 1935, the Dust Bowl really starts to get bad. Take a minute to look at the ominousness of this photograph of a dust storm forming over a car somewhere out in the west, or the aftermath of a dust storm very much like that one just photographed. You see entire farms pretty much buried in non-arable dirt. This is also the year that you see the AAA faltering, partly for reasons I've already mentioned, where it's not doing a very good job for the marginalized farmers, the tenant farmers, and the migrants. It's faltering also because the spectacle of the government-sponsored destruction of livestock and crops is pretty horrible. This opens the door to critics of FDR and his programs to just point out the utter and destructive absurdity of it as they see it. The NRA, the National Recovery Administration, is struck down by the Supreme Court. The NRA, the National Recovery Administration, is struck down by the Supreme Court in a case called Schechter versus U.S. Without devolving too much into the particularities of the law, which was summarized, I have to say, in my source in a fairly cursory fashion, the Supreme Court indicated that FDR, in the creation of this, had overextended his authority to directly influence citizens' lives without, Congress's compliance. And they struck it down also on a technicality where the government was supposed to be empowered to regulate trade between states, interstate trade, but in their estimation, the NRA intruded too much into trade within states, so the government was overstepping its boundaries to step on the prerogatives of state governments, and so it was struck down. So the New Deal, empowered in part by the Democrats' big majority now in Congress, which takes their seat in 1935 after winning their elections in 1934, begins to move left, and it's pushed left by several things, not the least of which are fiercely critical conservatives, represented, for example, by the American Liberty League. Their basic argument, the American Liberty League's argument, boiled down to the idea that the New Deal was undermining and destroying capitalism and installing socialism. And so this pure capitalism versus fear of socialism, a theme that we're hearing today, is by no means new and was very pronounced during debates at this time. Charles Coughlin, a Catholic priest with a weekly radio show and a highly subscribed newsletter, began to criticize FDR. And Coughlin, in the course of his radio show, became increasingly fascist, that is to say, pro-Hitler, who was already emerging as a known personality in Europe by this time, and really virulently anti-Semitic. And I think that Coughlin saw FDR's willingness to put a guy like Henry Morgenthau and his administration as all part of a nefarious conspiracy. Coughlin was eventually ordered off the air by his superiors in the Catholic Church, but not before he developed a big following of people that began to agree with his objection to FDR. Francis Townsend was a doctor who came up with a highly impractical plan for using a 2% sales tax to fund monthly checks of $200 to every retired person over 60. The one stipulation would be that they would have to spend those $200, and the idea was that they would receive the $200, they would spend it, and that would stimulate the economy. Well, you can imagine that was pretty popular with retired old people, and so he had quite a following. And this, in a sense, was pressure on FDR from the left that, in fact, some believe may have stimulated FDR's enthusiasm for the Social Security Act, which we'll get to soon elsewhere in this. Huey Long was a senator from Louisiana, and he was a fire-breathing, kind of demagogic speech maker who didn't like FDR and really did some effective left-wing rabble-rousing, where he would argue, for example, for 100% taxes on people who made more than $1 million a year, and that tax would go into guaranteed $5,000 income for everybody who needed it. And so Huey Long really was advocating a radical redistribution of wealth. And so here you have yet more pressure from the left on FDR to do something to respond to these challenges. That's Huey Long, who, before his program ever came to fruition, was actually assassinated during this period. One of the signature New Deal programs that emerged kind of around this time as we're moving into what's called the Second New Deal. This New Deal organization, the Works Project Administration, is probably the iconic program for what's called the Second New Deal. The Second New Deal starts essentially in 1935 and is marked by a movement left by FDR where he stops even trying to cooperate with businesses and people on the right who are critical of him and begins to more aggressively push a populist, or I should say more leftist agenda towards government involvement in trying to offer relief and stimulate the economy. Two famous sub-programs of the Works Project Administrations were the Federal Writers Project and the Federal Theater Project. So these were both under the auspices of the WPA, and they really typify, and to an interesting extent, some of the cultural impact of the New Deal. The Federal Writers Project, as its name suggests, funded writers who would do things like, write this guide to skiing in the East. It would have the dual purpose of employing these writers and creating literature that the government hoped would stimulate tourism and spending on recreation. I'm not sure what Moments with Genius are, but it's a pretty cool cover, and I think the art, captures kind of the brilliant vibe of that period. The Theater Project would fund choreography, for example, like this dance. And I wish I knew more about the faces sort of schematically portrayed in this. But the art from the New Deal, or I should say the New Deal stimulated some really brilliant poster art. Perhaps it's the golden age of government poster art. One of the other red letter laws from the Second New Deal was the National Labor Relations Act, otherwise known as the Wagner Act, after the congressman who sponsored it. And the National Labor Relations Act did a number of things that were really important for hourly wage workers from this time. One of which is it guaranteed their right to collective bargaining, something that if you look at the history of unions had been far from protected over the course of U.S. history. Collective bargaining, of course, is when unions, primarily with the potential leverage of the strike, get together and bring management to the negotiating table to work out a deal on demands. For example, increased wages or limiting workday hours. The NLRA mandated closed shops where, in situations where unions had a strong foothold, they could require all workers in that given shop to be in the union. And this act created the National Labor Relations Board, which was a government agency that created to act as mediators between labor and workers. This is a famous photograph of FDR signing the National Labor Relations Act into law. You'll see Francis Perkins standing behind him. The Social Security Act of 1935 is a famous Second New Deal law that still exists to this day. And the Social Security Act, as I pointed out, may have been in part response to Townsend's idea about distributing money to the old. But this law, through a combination of withholding from employers and employee contributions, would set aside money for working citizens so that when they retired, they would have some guaranteed income that the government would then disperse. Any of you who work, if you look at your pay stub, you'll notice a certain percentage of any pay that you earn gets set aside for Social Security, even at your young age. And so this law is still very much part of our landscape today. It brings us to the election of 1836. So this is the presidential election, and FDR is up for his first time as an incumbent. And this is going to be FDR versus Alf Landon. I guess he went by Alfred Landon. This is a picture of Alfred Landon. You'll see what I did there with him on the right. So he's the Republican. This is FDR at about that time. And FDR pretty much crushes Landon, as indicated by the blue. It's an even bigger margin of victory than he brought down on Hoover in the previous election. Only Maine and Vermont go Republican. All is not awesome news, however, for FDR in 1936. This is the year that the Agricultural Adjustment Act is struck down by the Supreme Court. They assert that something about the AAA violates basic limits on the extent of the government's ability or power to tax. And so the New Deal hostile Supreme Court strikes this down. FDR's reaction is problematic. This opens a chapter in the New Deal called the court packing scheme. Many of the justices were elderly. I think 6 of them were over the age of 70, and they were all kind of crusty conservative guys who did not like FDR much. And so FDR's proposal was that for every justice over 70, he could appoint a new justice who would, in effect, assist that justice and relieve them of the burden of their workload. And of course, in appointing those 6 justices, he could pick relatively liberal justices. The court packing scheme was entirely unpopular, both with Democrats and Republicans, who really saw it for what it was immediately, and it got nowhere. It was a rare, decisive defeat for FDR during this period, and it kind of cast a shadow on his administration at that year. FDR's problems didn't end with the court packing scheme in 1836. In 1837, partly as a result of some overconfidence on his administration's part and a throttling back of some of the government investment in the various forms of relief and recovery that they had been conducting to this point, America suffered a somewhat severe recession. A recession that's portrayed particularly effectively in this graph. So the vertical axis represents millions of workers by millions, and then the horizontal graph, of course, years. And this actually summarizes quite nicely both some of the things happening during the New Deal, but also the context for the New Deal. So, for example, 1921, you see a dip immediately after World War I, where the economy cools off as demand for food begins to decline. And as you will recall, the farmers begin going into a bit of a skid. However, the economy begins to revive through the course of the Roaring '20s. And so you see this nice ridge here indicating the period of relative prosperity during the Jazz Age, an era of prosperity that peaks in 1929 with the absurd overvaluation of stock, an evaluation that forms a very shiny speculative bubble that pops dramatically in the form of this decline between 1930 and 1932. And so this arrow points really at the context of the election that FDR wins to begin his first administration. And you see between 1933 and 1937 a steady upward climb as the economy actually begins to return to some of the levels that it was enjoying during the 20s. But right here is the 1937 recession, where again, FDR makes the mistake of trying to balance the federal budget. He raises taxes, he cuts back on government spending, and the economy almost immediately reacts by going into a decline. Now look at this and pay attention to the date, and the astute among you will note that the upward trend really gets going in 1939, which corresponds to the beginning of World War II, which creates all kinds of demands for the demand that fuels the rise of the American economy into the 1940s. The New Deal ends with a final flurry of a few laws, one of which requires mention, and that is the Farm Security Administration, which, as its name suggests, was primarily focused on trying to support farmers and to ensure that the downtrodden, this was part of an attempt to do better than the Agricultural Adjustment Act had done with the migrants and the tenant farmers. It's also famous for being the organization that put a team of photographers into the field, most famously including Dorothea Lange. This is also the year you see the AAA of 1938 and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. I don't really plan to elaborate much on those. I would like to talk more about the FSA, and in particular Dorothea Lange, who is photographed here out in the field taking pictures of farms and migrant workers. This is one of her iconic famous photographs. If you glance at this, you'll see some refugees from the Dust Bowl walking down the road, past the ironic billboard to their right. And this is, of course, her signature most famous photograph, Migrant Mother, which has been the object, actually, of some interesting recent scholarship and even a little bit of controversy around her appropriation of this image. So I'm not sure what the issues are in that. But this remains her most famous and iconic photograph. The New Deal, as a legislative soup of acronyms and government activism, is supplanted by world events. So in spite of Americans' enthusiasm for neutrality and an intense desire on the part of the public to stay out of what they see as the nefarious troubles of Europe, things are going on in Europe. And so here we have Benito Mussolini rising to power in Italy in 1922. He's the founder of fascism. Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany in 1933. And from his position of increasingly centralized authority, he remilitarizes the Rhineland in 1936, an overtly aggressive act that violates the Treaty of Versailles. The Allies do not respond. In 1937, Japan invades China. And in 1938, the Allies hope to appease Hitler by letting him have Czechoslovakia after the Munich Conference. The Blitzkrieg, the invasion of France, and Pearl Harbor kick off World War II for America. So it's already underway for Europe in 1939. America joins in 1941 and immediately declares itself the arsenal of democracy, mobilizing citizens across the nation to fight the war and support the effort. And here you have a picture of Rosie the Riveter, or an incarnation of Rosie the Riveter working in a factory. And it really is this, more than anything else, that pulls the United States out of the long and lingering effects of the Great Depression. The New Deal is subject to a whole lot of debate in terms of the true extent and actual nature of its effect. And to conclude, you just remember it was a highly improvised, kind of responsive thing put together that marks a major milestone in the expansion of presidential power and the influence of the United States government on its citizens.